Hello everyone, hope y'all are having an amazing day. Today what we're going to talk about is a video I've been thinking about for some time. It's basically walking you through how I would want to learn, software development if I could start all over again. And just for a little context, my name is Hector Pineda. I am currently a software developer. I'm about a year into my first professional job. And, I don't want you to think that I'm somebody that was just always super good at programming computers, this and that. The job I had prior to getting into tech, I was making about $12, $13 an hour, working part time. So, some months probably making less than $1,000 a month. And now, I'm lucky enough to be making over 80 grand a year, which again is a crazy change in life, right? Just going from barely getting by to getting this professional job. And again, this is something I kind of keep looking back on myself. It's now that I'm done, now that I finished my degree, because I did go back to school and to get my bachelor's, I do have a little bit better context on the order in which we learn things and how maybe I wish I had gone about, just going out of my way to learn things for myself in order to improve quicker, right? So if you're somebody that's thinking about going back to school, you're considering tech, whether it's through college, university, boot camp, self-taught, this video is just for you, because really this is a video I wish somebody had made for me, or that somebody had broken this down in a way that was consumable to the kind of thing that I want to do. Because at the end of the day, I think what ended up happening was, I've been interested in tech for years, right? It took me about 3 years to finish my degree because I had actually dropped out of college multiple times for multiple reasons. Sometimes I didn't like the major I had picked. Sometimes I just, I wasn't too crazy on taking classes when I could be working, right? But the interest for the tech industry was definitely there, right? And just to give you a little more context, this probably started way back in 2017, right? If you don't know what this website is, it's called Treehouse. Back in the day, right, as you can see, my membership is from 2017. They were one of the more popular ones for offering, programming courses, this and that. As you can see, my little badges of achievement from 2017. So that's 6-7 years ago, right? That's when that spark of programming and, coding and maybe I could do it, maybe I could get into it, kind of first really started to, come from me. Just me going out of my way to actually look into that and prototype it. But obviously, we're in 2024. I barely started my professional job last year when I graduated. So there was something that happened along the way, right, that made me delay that career path, right? So again, this for you, if you're someone that's thinking about going back, you're not too sure, maybe it's too complicated, maybe it's too many classes, maybe it's going to be a pain in the ass, maybe it's going to take too long to learn. But again, that's what we want to clarify, right? So this is kind of the breakdown that I have of the pathway of the things that I think you should learn, through the trajectory of any learning curriculum that's gonna involve you being job ready for, anything in tech and programming, that kind of stuff, right? And at the end of this, some of the prerequisites I think you do need to have is you need to feel confident in the direction that you're going, right? Whether it's a boot camp, whether it's going back to school. Something that I know made me lose a lot of time was, starting multiple courses, sometimes going into school, dropping out, that kind of stuff, taking breaks between semesters because of work or this and that. And I understand that life happens. I mean, there was a lot of inconveniences that happened throughout my journey, but I didn't always feel like what I was doing was the right thing. And, sometimes I would try to think of a better plan, and that can hold you back, right? Again, because I don't have a clear end goal of why it was that I was learning what I was learning and what that was supposed to get me in return, right? Other than just graduating and getting a degree. So number 2 is you want to know that the job you're doing is going to be a good fit for you, right? So one of the things you're going to see me, if you've seen any of my other videos, I do emphasize taking a personality test, particularly the Myers-Briggs personality test, because at the end of the day, something can sound cool on paper because it makes you money, because your friends do it and all that kind of stuff. But if you walk into that job and you're just miserable and you hate it, then it's really not going to be worth your time. It's not going to be worth the effort, especially not going to be worth the money if you're going into debt for something as expensive as a college degree, if you need to get loans like I did, or even boot camps are expensive, even though they're they take less time. So you want to make sure that if you're curious about this path, great, I'm cheering you on, but I would encourage you to take a personality test. I'll leave the links below, but you can do one at truity.com. And again, that's not my website or anything. That's just one that I've seen that's super easy. 16 types personality test. Go there. It's going to take 10 minutes of your time. Do it. You're going to get your personality type, and you can Google if, tech industry is a good fit for you, or rather what jobs in the tech industry and roles would be a good fit for that particular personality type. So knock that out. Let's get that out of the way, right? And then number 3 is you do have to accept that you never get to a point in time where you know everything. There's countless programming languages, countless frameworks, countless everything in the tech industry. It's always something new, something shinier, something cooler to learn, something better, something faster. And you never get to a point where you know it all. But you're going to meet different people, very intelligent people that know, a ton of different things. And that's going to make you feel like you're never going to get to that point. Because again, you're probably comparing yourself to all of them collectively rather than one-on-one individually. And also when you take into consideration what their background is, the years they've had an experience and all that kind of stuff, you're just doing yourself a disservice by thinking that you can get to a point in time where you could be as knowledgeable as them, right? And at the end of the day, you never know how smart truly people are. Some people just like to regurgitate knowledge. Some people just like to, they love it. It's their hobby. It's their life. If that's not you, that's okay. You shouldn't be comparing yourself to them anyway. So that's the other thing, right? So let's go through these. There's basically, I guess, 6 steps you could say to get you to a point where you have a solid foundation in technology, whether that's software development or anything like that, to get you to a point where you can take that skill and start making things on your own, start applying for jobs, start just getting a good grasp on what it is that it takes to be a marketable candidate, right? So let's start with number 1, right? So we want to learn a programming language, right? And programming, at the end of the day, people say it's like learning a second language, this and that. I don't necessarily agree with that. I would say that programming, at the end of the day, is how you communicate with a computer, right? Whether it doesn't matter what programming language you're learning, at the end of the day, is you're typing commands. It's still in the English format, but in such a way that these are understandable by the compiler, right? Now, I'm gonna try my best not to get into any fancy technical language, but yeah, at the end of the day, is any programming language, whether you're learning C, Python, whatever, you're just learning how to talk to a computer, right? In a way that the computer understands, right? Now, especially that you have tools like ChatGPT or generative AI technologies, it makes it that much easier to learn any programming languages or to understand what the relationships are, right? What I mean by that is that if, let's say, you were to look up a sample code for Python project or Java or whatever, and you were to paste that into ChatGPT, you could ultimately just ask it to explain the code to you line by line. So you'd really have almost like your own private tutor explain to you what programming is, right? But the point of taking your first programming class is, 1, to see if you like it, and 2, liking it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy for you, right? Liking it means that there's going to be frustration. There's going to be things that don't run when they're supposed to run. It's going to be finding out that this big error you thought you had was just something as simple as missing a comma, missing a period. But as you start seeing that workflow of, learning the language, debugging or figuring problems out, you're going to see really quickly if the joy of figuring out that solution is worth the trouble that you have to go through in order to get there, right? So that's really what your first programming class is. And really, I don't think you should emphasize too much or worry too much about what language you learn. I would say something like Java or C is recommended, just because those are very old, still very relevant languages. Everybody's going to tell you that Python is a lot easier and it's a lot more reader friendly, which is true, but I don't think that sets a super accurate example of what you're going to go through if you have to learn a different language, right? And that's something that's going to be expected in the industry, that you can learn quickly, that you can adapt quickly, that you can teach yourself. So if you're a beginner and you don't have clear context on what's expected of you, I wouldn't recommend necessarily going for the easiest thing. I also wouldn't recommend going for the hardest thing either, right? But again, that's just my opinion on that. And then I guess one last point I put here is that, you want to get comfortable enough to use the language. You learn data types, you learn how to do loops in it, you learn how to debug it and look for errors. But if you've seen any college curriculum for a computer science degree, it's not like you're expected to learn 20 different languages, right? You're going to learn 1, 2, 3, and then have introductory class on those languages. And then depending on the class you take later on, like if you take web development, whatever language is used on there is going to be up to the professor. It's not necessarily going to be a prerequisite that you took a class, an introductory class with that language before, right? No, it's going to be expected that, you've been getting in this industry, you've been learning how to program. Not that how you learn to program isn't necessarily relevant. What's important is that you learn how to. So now the expectation is that you can teach yourself, right? So that's really the most important thing about your first programming class, right? And again, whether you take that, if you want to be self-taught, you want to do it through Udemy, you want to do it through YouTube, focus on that first class. And again, don't go into this tutorial hell loophole of now you want to learn Python, so you take a full 8 to 20 hour course on that. Now you want to learn Java, so you take a full 8 to 20 course on that. That's going to take you months, and I don't think that's the right expectation, right? You don't go into a job solely because you understand the programming language, right? You get a job because you understand, the full length of the software development process. Cool, so now we're going to number 2, right? And this can be called version control, or the most popular one in the industry is Git, right? Where that's through using GitLab or GitHub. What we refer to version control is, let me give you an example, right? If you've ever collaborated with any of your friends on a Google Doc, right? Let's say you guys are working on a research paper. I'm sure you've seen that feature on Google Docs where you can both edit at the same time, right? You can see that little, scrolling thing where somebody's typing, and as they type, they see it, right? Well, that's all very nice when you're working on it, but if you're not looking, your friend might delete something that you wrote, or you might delete something that they wrote, right? And after that, it becomes a mess, right? Of course, Google has very nice features where you can undo and all that stuff, but imagine, you didn't have that, and your friend deleted a whole paragraph that you worked hours on. Well, that'd be very inconvenient, right? Now, what might have happened is that maybe your friend didn't see that paragraph, maybe didn't see those changes, and they just accidentally pressed delete, right? It wasn't intentional or anything like that. So that's just one example of version control, right? Obviously, you guys want to know you're both looking at the most recent, most accurate, and a working copy of the essay you're both working on, right? You don't want to overwrite his work, and you don't want him to overwrite your work, right? Also, you don't want him to be looking at an older version of your you don't want him to be looking at an older version of your document, right? If you made some changes, if you made some additions, and vice versa. So it's the same with programming, right? Now, when you're working on an application or something like that, it's not as neat as Google Docs where you can see what things are getting updated, but you do have a version of the code in your computer running locally, just like your partner, classmate, coworker has a version of it on their, local work machine, right? So what version control refers to is making sure that you're both consistently using, a working and most up-to-date version of that, right? So that's where Git comes in, right? That's technology that's been around for a couple decades. I forget the name of the guy that made it, but he gets a lot of props for that. Starts with a T, something like that. But anyway, when you get to use that, it's going to be very important for when you start working in class projects. It's going to be extremely important when you get to a professional level, because that's a very day-to-day thing, right? Where the code lives, that's called like your repository. So the version of the code that is actively being deployed on production. So the version of the code that the company uses for their applications, right? If things are going to be made adjusted to that, well, then you have to do what's called pulling, right? So you download that to your machine, or you pull it, right? If you make changes to that, you then have to push it back to the repository, right? That's the updated version. Again, where it gets a little complex is that if you were working on some changes and your partner was working on some changes, and you both try to update that or push to the repository, there's going to be conflicts on that, and you have to know how to resolve those conflicts. Again, there's a lot of YouTube tutorials on that. But again, I just want to emphasize that's a super helpful skill that you could start learning and start applying right after you take your first programming course, right? You don't have to wait till you learn multiple languages or until you're working with trying to build web apps to start learning how to use this, right? The earlier you make a GitHub account, and I say GitHub because it's free, and the earlier you start looking at tutorials on how to pull repositories, how to push changes and all that stuff, that's going to save you hours and hours of headaches later on in the future, both at school as well as in your professional career. So highly recommend that. So now we get into MVC, or Model View Controller. So that's just a framework that's used for whenever applications are made, right? So you have, again, like the title says, like your Model View Controller, right? So these are, and specifically in Java, these are the different types of classes that you use to create an app, right? So what I'm referring to in that regard is that you're gonna have certain files that are only made to create what the application looks like, right? You're gonna have certain files that are made only to handle how the data is being transferred in the application, and then you can have other files that are solely focused on the logic for how the application does everything, right? So one is about how it looks, the logic behind it, and how the data is controlled. So this is when you start getting a little more into application development, right? Because at the end of the day, if you've taken any programming class, which the assumption for this video is that you haven't, it's not just writing endless lines of code. It's not just, looking for bugs, this and that. Like, no, it's, at the end of the day, there does have to be a very set form of organization in which these projects are made, right? Again, there's different frameworks, there's a lot of different ways that you can do this, but this is going to be one of the more widely known and one of the more basic ones that lets you put into practice what you've learned from your first programming class. And there's going to be seeing examples made in this model are going to be what let you start getting a better gauge on how multiple files for a single project kind of communicate with one another, right? And again, whether you decide to work on this with a buddy or by yourself, this is what gives you exposure on some of the more realistic expectations for when projects are being built out, right? So I know it's going a little bit fast, but like I said, you cover programming 1, right? You get exposed to your first programming language. You go to a version control, so now you know how to push code to a repository. Now you know how to pull projects, and again, that's going to be very helpful. Just even when you're working with sample projects from other creators or other developers. You get into the MVC, right? The Model View Controller model, and that's where you really start getting a little more exposure on building, things like Java apps or Android apps, that kind of stuff. That's going to help you get more comfortable with bigger projects. But at this point, everything has been working locally, right? You just have all these files, all these Java files or whatever that are running on your computer. And if you did, something related with data before, you're probably pulling data from something like a .csv file, right? So like something that had all the data you needed, and then you probably opened it and parsed it, and that's how you pulled data out, right? And that was, if you did that in your first programming class, or if you, just for context, that's probably what you're going to do until you start working with databases, right? So when you get to learning about databases, the one I would recommend, and the one most people are going to recommend, is going to be SQL. Some people like to pronounce it SQL, but I see the letters, so I just pronounce it like that. But again, databases just refers to how data is being stored, right? Now it's very similar to, I'm sure you've seen an Excel spreadsheet, right? It has your different column names, and for all those column names, which are like just properties of each row, right? Like if you have a record of clients, right, each client has their name, phone number, email address, and then each row is a different client, right? So databases work in a similar fashion in terms of how data is stored, but also it's just not going to be as pretty as Excel, right? Excel looks very nice because it's meant for you to click around, highlight, add stuff. The main point of Excel is to process data and maybe even customize it. But the point of Excel isn't for you to, pull data or push data, right? It's not even meant to store. It's more to showcase, um, documents and that are just typically more so on the, you know, on the mathematical data side of things. So because you already know how to make apps locally at this point, right? When you learn how to program, you learn how to version control, you learn a little more about application models. Well, now you can learn about how databases connect to user interfaces, right? And a good part of that, well, before you learn that, you do have to learn a little bit on how databases work, right? And again, if you end up liking databases, there's people that become database administrators. They make a lot of money, and that's all they do. They just set up databases, they install them, they make sure other people have access to them, and that's a great job. So you might love it, or you might hate it, at which case, even if you hate it, then it's worth learning the basics just to get a good grasp on that. But again, just a quick overview, databases and learning SQL just refers to how data is stored and how those transactions are made between the application and so on and so forth, right? After that, you're going to want to learn a little bit about networking. And I say that because I had the option to take a networking class in my degree plan, which I didn't because I had already originally, when I was in and out considering what I was going to study for school, I'd started, my own self-taught journey for getting the CCNA? It's one of those IT certifications. So I read some chapters on that. It was interesting enough. I wasn't too engaged, but I felt like I had a good foundation. But again, you want to take networking. At the end of the day, any device, any technology communicates to one another, whether it's your laptop trying to talk to a different server, whether that's on the cloud or anything like that. Any type of communication, there's gonna be a set of repeating protocols that are followed, which if you're not paying attention to, those might cause some issues in terms of like permissions, what your machine can or can't do, the kind of requests it can or can't send. So that's gonna be something nice to have on your backlog. Well, that's gonna be something nice for you to have in your tool bag in case you run into problems later on, right? Now, networking is also, I would say, one of those rabbit holes that you can get a ton of certifications on, just like databases. You can make your whole career about networking. There's network administrators, all that stuff. I'm sure, have you heard of a lot of people that work in IT deal a lot with setting up, different, a lot of like networking stuff. So you can definitely go down that rabbit hole. But if not, you should at least get familiar with it, right? And then at the end, right, we put it all together, right? That's when we start into web development, right? And the reason why I put that on the end is because, well, you learn how to program, right? You learn how to program, you learn how to control, how to upload your code to a repository. You learn more or less the structure of what an application project needs to have. You learn how that application you created can communicate with a database. You learn how, now that you know about databases and networking, you probably learn a little about hosting those different types of servers, right? Or how they might, or what they need in order to communicate to each other. So when it comes to web development, you can now create a web application, right? Because you know about creating the interface. That was what you learned in programming. That's what you learned when you learned the MVC model. And what you're going to learn on top of this, you're going to learn a little more about client server relationships, right? Because if you want a web application, that can't just live on your local computer. That probably, you probably want to host that somewhere. Same thing for your database, right? You don't want records and files and transactions to be dependent on your computer being on. You want that to be hosted and live somewhere else, right? That would be your database server. So now you have an application server and you have a database server, and those two have to play nice and talk to each other. And, in order for you to do that, you do have to have a pretty decent, pretty extensive background knowledge in terms of the principles and things in technology that you learned to get to this point. And now making that project, it's going to be its own challenge in and of itself, right? But My whole point is that I don't want you to wait until your junior or senior year to start working on this project for yourself, right? Because at the end of the day, um, your college degree, you're going to take multiple programming classes, you're going to take multiple math classes, you're going to take algorithms classes, you're going to take electives, this and that. And it can take those 4 years or even longer before you get to a point where you can start putting it all together, right? So I'm trying to highlight the basics of what you need to learn in order to get to that point. Because once you start getting to that point, you can start making cool things that you're interested in, things that are fun to make, and things that you can put in your resume in order to start applying for jobs, internships, or really just so you can start learning more, right? But I think that's the gist of it, right? And again, if you took it at a slow pace, this isn't meant for you to rush it and this and that. Even if you took maybe your programming course while you're taking other, maybe you're in school and you haven't even started taking any programming classes, right? Because you got, what's that thing you take in college at first? Not your, you got to take your basics and all that, right? All those philosophy and English classes. You could just start taking programming one from a YouTube course on your own. Your first semester, second semester, you take in the spring just a little class on Git. And again, these aren't going to be long classes. These are like 1, 2, maybe 3 hour courses you can take on YouTube. In the summer, you start learning about MVC. Then again, in the fall, take a database course, networking in the spring again, summer again. So even if you did it at a very slow pace, just on your free time, because you go to school and you got to go to work and maybe you got other stuff to do, you could still learn this, I mean, within 2 years, right? And it'll be very nice to see how this all comes together as you get farther and farther along in these steps, right? Rather than just taking a philosophy class or a business class, even though it's not really your major, and even though you still have to pay for it and all that kind of stuff, right? So again, guys, this is just my perspective, my opinion. There's a ton, I'm sure there's hundreds if not thousands of videos on people saying how they could, how they would want to learn programming all over again, software development. But it's just my take on it. Again, I'll emphasize that I know I took a long time to come back around and finish my degree, but the interest was definitely there since a long time ago. I guess I wish I had maybe just stuck with it, but can't do anything about it now. I do hope that something like this helped you gain a clear path on whether there's something you want to do. Maybe you've been neglecting just hopping on a course on YouTube. Maybe you've been putting off going back to school, or maybe you have a friend that's in tech and you kind of want to ask him some questions, but you haven't really gotten around to it. That's what helped me too. Honestly, I had a couple of friends that majored in this, and I guess I was too shy or something to ask about it. But when I finally did, I think that also helped me push me a little more into going back to school, right? So again, I hope this helped. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. Shoot me a message. I'm probably gonna leave some links below for some other stuff or not. I don't think I mentioned any of those in this video, but I hope this helps, and I wish you the best of luck in your career.